reformism, or what Lenin called opportunism, or I can't remember how else you pronounce it, is really the great problem for revolutions in the 20th century. And I think we have to start by recognizing that reformism is not merely not revolutionary, it is in fact counter-revolutionary. And really, if you want the proof of that, Lenin met the proof of it for the first time in 1914. And it has been demonstrated that reformism is counter-revolutionary ever since, right through the failure of the social democratic parties of Europe to oppose the war in 1914, the attitude of the German Social Democratic Party in 1918-1919, the murder of Rosa Luxemburg, the defeat of the general strike in Britain, the defeat of the Chinese Revolution, the failure of the German Social Democratic Party to stand up properly to the rise of Hitler, the failure of the popular fronts in France, for example, the defeat of the Spanish Revolution in the 1930s, time and again the question of reformism, first in the shape of the Labour parties and social democratic parties of Europe, and then from the 1930s, the communist parties also, reformist organizations, acting as a deliberate barrier to revolutionary development. And it continues after the war and continues taking different shapes at different times in different countries, right through, for example, to Poland, 1980 to 1981, when reformism in the shape of Lech Wałęsa, the Catholic Church, etc., still plays a counter-revolutionary role within the workers' movement. And there's no question that as revolutionaries, we have to combat reformism. And in order to combat it, we have to understand it. Now, one of the theories about where reformism comes from and what it is, which we inherit, is the theory of Lenin. Lenin's theory of the labor aristocracy, and for a whole generation probably, until not that long ago, I suspect, most people in the world calling themselves Marxists would have said the key to understanding reformism is Lenin's theory of the labor aristocracy. And Lenin developed this theory in the early years of the First World War. And I think we need to understand the background a little bit to understand how Lenin came to formulate his theory. Firstly, what was the situation he found himself in? Before the First World War, the great international socialist congresses of Europe, essentially of Europe, the European socialist parties, and above all the conference of the Second International at Basel in Switzerland in November 1912, had declared that there must be international working class opposition to bourgeois militarism. That if there was a war, it would, they said, be a crime for a worker to shoot at worker. It would be necessary in the event of war to agitate and make propaganda using the crisis induced by the war to hasten the end of class rule in the world. If there was a war, it must be the occasion, they said, for launching the struggle to transform capitalism into socialism. Now, in the event, as is all too well known, there was a total betrayal by the major parties of the International of those promises. The German Social Democratic deputies voted in the Reichstag for war credit in August 1914. The Labour Party in Britain, not surprisingly, voted for war. The TUC entered into an agreement with the government, or the Treasury Agreement, which said there shall be no strikes during the war, wage control, government wage control, no strikes. All the strikes during the war were in fact unofficial, illegal strikes, with the agreement of the TUC. The TUC accepted conscription of labour into the factories and into the army. In France, the socialists backed their government. Plekhanov, the father of Russian Marxism, supported the Tsarist government and the Russia-French-British alliance against the Germans. Kautsky, the Pope of Marxism, takes the same position in Germany in relation to his government and so on. Lenin, it has to be said, Now, there's a minority within the International that holds to principle. Two parties in particular, the Italians, for most of the war, until Italy joined the war. Secondly, the Russian party, in the shape of the Bolsheviks anyway, with the Mensheviks wavering, and the Lets. I don't know why the Lets, but the Lettish Social Democrats took a completely honourable position on the question of the war. Lenin, when it happened, when he learned the news of how particularly the German Social Democratic Party had voted, was shocked. He wasn't prepared for this event. He was shocked. He couldn't believe it. He said, if you read Krupskaya's memoirs, she says, Lenin couldn't believe it about Plekhanov. And he tried to explain it in terms of Plekhanov once upon a time having been in the army, as if somehow that would explain his attitude to war. When he first, it's reported, I can't find the source, but Cliff says, and I don't know where he got it from, that when Lenin first saw the papers reporting that the German Social Democrats had voted for war credits in the German Reichstag, in the parliament in Germany, that he thought the papers were a forgery at first. The reason I think that he was so surprised is that perhaps that he didn't understand the German Social Democratic Party as well as perhaps he should. He didn't understand it certainly as well as Rosa Luxemburg did. But if you look at the history of the German Social Democrats, they had already been preparing the way for their defection from working class internationalism before the war. For example, the leaders had in 1911, when there was an imperialist crisis over Morocco, the Agadir crisis as it was called, the leaders of the Social Democratic Party in Germany had tried to avoid the question of the military conflict because it might lose them votes. And so they tried to avoid the question on the husting, just wish it out of existence rather than face up to it. Again, their members, their MPs in Parliament, had actually urged that social democratic cooperatives should get hold of contracts for the army, to supply clothing to the army. In other words, they actually wanted to get this sort of business, as if Socialist Worker was complaining to the government that we don't get recruiting ads for the police paid for in our paper. I think if we ever did find ourselves in that situation, we'd probably find ourselves with a small split in the organisation. When you look at Lenin's writings, once he's got over the shock, and it only takes him a day or two to get over the shock, you look at Lenin's writings, 1914 onwards, up to the Russian Revolution, then he writes about almost nothing else. There are two questions which absorb him. One is the question of the defection of the International, the collapse of the Second International. The other is the national question. He writes about almost nothing else in that period. And he bitterly, sharply condemns the traitors to socialist internationalism. Kautsky, he says, was a prostitute. Later he merely calls him a renegade. He calls him a prostitute. And it has to be said that, if you read Krupskaya's memoirs, that he is not condemning prostitutes, he's condemning Kautsky. He regards prostitutes as far nicer people than Kautsky, because he spent a large part of the war living in a house in Zurich where there are all sorts of people who were indeed living on the streets in various kinds of ways in the same house as him. He used to enjoy the conversation at dinner every evening with indeed a Zurich prostitute. And he didn't want to move from that house to another house, although the food was better elsewhere, because there was such good political conversation. So it's not the prostitute angle, it's the swine Kautsky that he's really going for. The woman for all times, he calls him. And he allows no excuses at all. This is what he writes about the German Social Democrats. He said their excuses, well, we weren't really strong enough to be able to oppose the war. And he says, even with their total impotence, they should have voted against. They should not have joined their government and uttered chauvinist infamies. They should not have shown solidarity with their nation. And they should not have defended their own bourgeoisie. And every time it's underlined, not. They should have unmasked its vileness. No question, absolutely no quarter is to be given at all. He reports how one German Social Democratic MP had said in a meeting with some workers just after the outbreak of war, well, we couldn't oppose it, we would have been arrested. And he says there was a worker in the audience who said, so what would have been so bad about that? Absolutely right. What would have been, you could ask the same question to Sam McCluskey. What would have been so bad about that? About you being arrested? Quite right, absolutely correct. Nothing would have been wrong with it at all. And he notes in the early months of the war, he says, at last we have had a voice against the war. and he quotes a long statement saying that the war is disgusting, it's absolutely against the interests of the people of Europe, that what it shows is that the only way forward in Europe is that there must be some kind of federal socialist Europe must come out of the war. And he says, who is saying this? Is it the German Social Democrats, the French socialists, the British socialists? No, he says, it is a group of kind-hearted little churchmen from Zurich who are saying this. It's very like the situation today. You listen to Kinnock, bloody rubbish, and then you hear the Methodist president saying in the Congress of Methodists, evil capitalism and so on. Far much to the left of bloody Kinnock. I wonder if we should be doing entry work in the Methodist Church. Perhaps we should discuss that question with the militant comrades. Now, the two questions which Lenin then faces, really, over and over again, and which he argues and argues and argues, are these. Firstly, where did this, what he calls social chauvinism, he says we mustn't even call it patriotism, social chauvinism, this collapse into supporting bourgeois governments in an imperialist war, where did it come from? What gave it strength? And the second question he asks is, how are we to combat this trend? And let's be quite clear, most of his attention is devoted to the second question. How are we to combat the trend? That's the emphasis in nearly all of Lenin's writings in that period, is not about the theoretical question, it's about the practical question. He has page after page after page denouncing Kautsky, denouncing Plekhanov, denouncing the German Social Democrats, denouncing Trotsky for being soft, for not being hard, as it were, for not being hard enough against these people, and so on and so on. But all his attention is devoted to the practical question in reality. And the conclusions that he comes to are very clear. The split in the International is a fact. It isn't something that can be ignored, it is an absolute fact, we have to proclaim it. The International is dead. It has collapsed. It is split, finished. The majority, he says, are agents of the bourgeoisie within the working class movement. That's the attitude we have to take. The majority in the International are finished. They're agents of the bourgeoisie, and therefore it is necessary for us to prepare for and work for and proclaim a break with the right wing and the centre, not only the right but also the centre, Kautsky. It is essential to have a break with them, open break. There must be no quarter whatever given to what he calls the defensists, those who defend their own governments. The left must, he says, be rallied and toughened, and a new Third International must be built. It's absolutely hard. There's no concession at all in Lenin's writings to any degree of softness on this question. And he's absolutely, let's be clear, he was absolutely correct in the practical attitude. But then we come, of course, to the question of explanation. Lenin's theory of why this had happened. But I think you have to understand, the reason I put it in context is the most important question for Lenin is the practical question, and on the practical question, Lenin is diamond crystal hard, or whatever his expression, I'm mixing my metaphors, crystal clear and diamond hard and absolutely 100% correct. The explanation is not as good as the attitude that he takes. Now, in reality, to call Lenin's theory, to refer to Lenin's theory is actually a bit of an exaggeration. I mean, I especially bought the 3 volumes of Lenin from volumes 21, 22 and 23, I think it is, from the outbreak of the war through to the Russian Revolution, and I read them, waiting to read Lenin's theory. And in hundreds and hundreds of pages, as I read and read and read, I read about the political conclusions, the need to build a Third International, the need to smash the right wing, the need to be clear, the need to be hard, and so on and so on and so on, the denunciations over and over again of Kautsky and so on. And every now and again, as I was reading, I would come across the odd sentence, or 2 sentences, or at most half a page in terms of explanation. I mean, if I was to threaten to hit one of the comrades here with Marx's theory of capitalism, over the head, with Marx's theory of capitalism, it would be a serious physical threat. 3 volumes of Capital, 3 volumes of the theories of surplus value, and the Grundrisse, and perhaps some unpublished writings that we have yet to read, it would be a weighty thump on the head, probably crush your skull. But if I was to threaten to hit you with Lenin's theory of the labour aristocracy, it would be like throwing feathers at you, in reality. Little half page here, little line there, and so on and so on. What he makes, in reality, are quick summary remarks. His interest, I don't believe, was centrally on the question of explaining. His interest was focused on the question of fighting. It's really only because of the later political authority of Lenin in the world socialist movement, because of the Russian Revolution, that Lenin's occasional remarks have been turned into a major theory. That has given his quote-unquote theory its prominence. Now, let's begin by noting that on two questions I think he's correct, before I come to the points where I think he's wrong. Firstly, he says social chauvinism, the collapse of these parties into supporting their governments in the war, is rooted in reformism. It isn't an isolated phenomenon, it's connected with the whole practice and theory of reformist politics in times of peace as well. It's not accidental. It is a product, as he puts it, of general opportunism. That's Lenin's word for reformism. It's a sign of the general abandonment of revolutionary politics. It's a sign of the parliamentary cretinism that has infected the socialist parties of Europe, and a sign of their complete emphasis on legal activity, no sense at all of the necessity also to be ready for illegal activity. That's the first thing, where I think he's right. Social chauvinism arises out of, is a direct product of reformism in the movement. And secondly, he's absolutely right to say that the collapse of the Second International is not simply a problem of individuals. It's not that this individual betrayed and that individual betrayed. It's part, as he puts it, of a social trend in the European labour movement. It's the product, he suggests, of a whole period of relatively peaceful development of capitalism in the last part of the 19th century and the early years of the 20th century. And up to that point, I have to say that I think he's absolutely right. But how do we explain this trend? And here I think we begin to meet difficulties. I mean, Lenin draws on a few hints, where Donny referred to them yesterday in his talk, a few hints in Engels, writing odd remarks in the 1880s. His explanation of this trend is, he says, firstly, to understand the war, we have to understand that the war is a product of imperialism. It is a product of the struggle amongst the major imperialist powers for the redivision of the world. The world has been filled up by imperialism now. All the major territories have been captured. All the major markets have been captured by different imperialist powers. Now the struggle is over the redivision of the loot, as it were. And that's the heart of his analysis of the First World War. And he goes on to say that out of the colonies, the imperialist powers receive super profits. The super exploitation of the colonies produces super profits which flow back from the colonies to the imperialist bourgeoisies of Germany, England, France, and so on. And here we come to the dodgy part of it, part of these super profits, part of what he calls the morsels of loot, or the privileges associated with this, are passed over to a small layer at the top of the working class. And it is this section which is bought off with the imperialist loot, with the morsels of loot from colonial exploitation, which ally themselves with the bourgeoisie and are the source of opportunism in the movement. That's the heart of, when I say I want to remind you all the time, when I say his theory, it's the summary of his remarks, when he's actually mostly discussing other questions. Now he says about this layer, this source of opportunism and reformism in the workers' movement, he says this layer is an insignificant section. That's one phrase he uses. Another point, he says, an infinitesimal minority of the working class. It's made up, he says, and he has a slightly random list which varies from one occasion to another, but it includes such people as union officials, parliamentarians, some of the better paid workers and office employees, he says. Another phrase is the labour bureaucracy and labour aristocracy. Another phrase, a stratum of privileged workmen who are bourgeoisified, in quotation marks. A section of the working class that he says, isolated from the misery and suffering and revolutionary temper of the impoverished and ruined masses. So the picture is of a small layer, variously defined, but sometimes called the labour aristocracy, at the top of the working class that is living significantly better than the majority of the working class who are impoverished and ruined and have, he says at one point, revolutionary temper, while this group at the top is allied to the bourgeoisie and bought off essentially with the fruits of super exploitation in the colonies. At one point, in an article in October 1916, one of the last things that he writes on this before the revolution, he more or less seems to suggest that he regards the whole of the organised working class as being bought off by the bourgeoisie, and says that the solution, and he actually says this will be Marxist tactics, the solution to this problem will be to go down lower and deeper to the real masses. That is to say, to those parts of the working classes in Europe which are not organised into trade unions. And that will be the solution. Now that idea is only hinted at once, and a terrible idea, that the whole of the organised working class is written off in that way, as bought off by the bourgeoisie. It's taken to an absurdity by his comrade and close collaborator during the war, Zinoviev. Zinoviev, at one point, Cliff quotes this, says that the munitions workers of Europe are, quote-unquote, tools of reaction. Tools of reaction. I mean, if we were to take such a position in relation to the work, it'd be rather like I was saying about the workers at Vickers, for example, they're tools of reaction. You know, I was trying to remember the name of that atom plant up on the coast. Sellafield workers, all the Vickers workers and so on, tools of reaction. It's a terrible position to take, especially when you see what those munitions workers were already doing during the war in terms of developing a fight, and of course the role that they were to play in at the end of the war. Basically, I think we have to say that Lenin's theory, and I want to put this word theory in quotation marks for the reason I've explained. Lenin's theory is a very poor theory of reformism. It has a strength, and that is that it focuses on the devastation caused within the movement by the leader's treachery. It focuses on the importance of organisation. That's a strength in it. And it's strong in at least trying to answer the problem, which is a real problem, which is why was it that the vanguard of the working class, the organised section of the working class, that section of the class which had got some confidence and strength in its own abilities to organise and confront the system, was not in fact giving a proper lead to the rest of the class. I mean, it's right to be asking those questions in a sense, though he doesn't quite formulate it in those terms. Those are the right questions to be asking, but I think we have to say that the theory is wrong. Now, what's wrong with it? Essentially, I'm going to follow Cliff, except in one small respect. Cliff has the honour, it seems to me, of being the first, offering the first serious Marxist criticism in the 1950s of Lenin's theory in his article, The Economic Roots of Reformism, which is republished in that collection by Cliff from Washington, neither Washington nor Moscow, sorry, not from Washington to Moscow. It's Sunday morning. You see, the first thing we have to say is that Lenin is wrong in the fundamental characterization of reformism as being a problem, and we know this, if you like, from practical experience of trying to sell the paper and trying to organize our organization. We know that, and there's no reason to suppose that our experience is that much different in that respect from, say, the situation at the time of the First World War, or in the late 19th century, early 20th century. Reformism is not a problem of a small layer in the working class. It is a problem of the whole working class. That's the first thing. We have to start with that. It has very deep roots in the whole of the class. That's the first thing we have to say. The second thing is, anyway, that the mechanism, if Lenin was right, and it is the problem of the bribing of a small layer, and that's a term he used at one point, bribing. If it is a problem of bribing of a small layer of the class, then what exactly is the mechanism by which this works? One has to ask this. If this is supposed to be an economic theory, what's the mechanism by which this economic process occurs? Here we've got, on the one hand, capitalists making super profits, and on the other hand, apparently, workers getting higher wages. What's the mechanism by which this bribing process occurs? I mean, I never heard of a boss who gathers his workers together, a section of his workers, the skilled workers together, and says, "Boys, I made loads of money. right? And here's some for you. Right? I'm bribing you. You have more than the rest, right? Loads of money. It's a sort of, it's not quite loads of money because I'm going to give some of you some of it. I'm going to pull some of you towards me so that you'll split the labour movement. The truth is that when you look at the real processes in the development of in wage movements and so on, when wages move, when one section, generally speaking, the sense is when one section of workers makes gains, others do so as well. The working class doesn't move in a completely fragmented way on the wages front. It moves very often in a very complicated way. Bits of leapfrogging going on, one bit moving forward and then another bit moving forward, but there's a tendency in the history of wages for wages to move up or down as a block in the class. In the second half of the 19th century, the standard of living of the working class in Britain rose overall. It isn't simply the case that the skilled workers had an improvement in their standard of living. The whole of the working class experienced improvements in its standard of living. We move as a class together. We may not have a sense of being together because of a lack of class consciousness and class organisation, but the fact is that the class, in a very complicated way, nonetheless tends to move together in terms of its standard of living. And that's certainly what happened in the 19th century, in the second half of the 19th century in Britain. I mean, there's arguments amongst historians, which I'm not qualified to go into, about what happened to real wages and so on in the first half of the 19th century. Everybody agrees in the second half of the 19th century, the general real wages of the whole of the working class rose. There's another problem, you see. If the connection is, Lenin suggests the connection is between the export of capital and the flow back of super profits from the colonies and the buying off of the labour aristocracy. The biggest increases in wages in the 19th century occurred, as I understand it, between about 1850 and 1880, maybe 1890. The 1890s, which is the period of the biggest outflow of capital from Britain, when the imperialist mechanism is at its height, when Britain is indeed sending its armies out and conquering large parts of Africa, painting the map red. I remember my old school atlas when I was a kid. You could look at it and see how much of it is ours. The empire in which the sun never set. All those red bits. I don't know why they called it red for Britain, but the red bits were all ours, and it was all over the place. And a lot of it was got in the last years of the 19th century. Is that the period in which there is this great bribing of the labour aristocracy? Trouble is, the 1890s, you look at the history of the labour movement in Britain, is the period of an employer's offensive against the skilled workers, the most organised section of the class. That's the decade of the lockout of the engineers over the question of managerial prerogatives in industry. It's when the employers are beginning to launch an attack on, in the crucial engineering industry and munitions industry, an attack on the ability of the skilled workers to control the job, because they're wanting to introduce new machinery and so on, and they take the unions on and they beat them. There's another big struggle in the boot and shoe industry in the 1890s. I've forgotten the details, and on the question of the details of history, I'm going to defer to all the comrades here who know more about it than I do. But it seems to be quite clear that there's no synchronization between the mechanism of imperialist expansion on the one side and the condition of the labour movement and the struggles of the labour movement on the other. It doesn't work as a theory. Again, when we look at these so-called labour aristocrats in the period of the First World War, you look at the outcome of the First World War, the Russian Revolution, the German workers' revolution, the Turin movement, and so on, and so on, and so on. What do we find? The munitions workers, the engineering workers, and so on. The very people who seem to be the heart of the conservative labour aristocracy of the second half of the 19th century are the militant leading vanguard in the class. It doesn't make sense at all, the theory. They're not the most conservative section in the class by the end of the war. They are indeed the militant vanguard of the class. They are the people who, the storm centres of the revolution in Europe are the engineering cities. Leningrad, or Petrograd then, Turin, Milan, Berlin, and so on. And Donny's book on the Western Soviets makes it very, very clear how important the engineering workers in particular were, in big blocks of confident workers in the major munition factories, engineering factories attached to, and so on, at the end of the war. There's one other point, I think, which needs to be made, which Cliff doesn't make in the 1950s, and which he couldn't make in the 1950s because the experience didn't yet exist. And certainly Lenin couldn't make this point in 1914, 1915, 1916, because the experience didn't exist. Lenin, and Cliff even, attached the question of reformism still, in some way, to the question of imperialism, to the ownership of colonies, and so on. Cliff doesn't question that part of it, but he then looks for other mechanisms and other processes to connect these two together. But today we have to say, after the experience of the 70s and 80s, that you can have reformism in a mass workers' movement without any connection with colonies at all. Where are Chile's colonies, comrades? Right? No question that reformism played a terrible counter-revolutionary role in Chile in the early 1970s and led to the tragic destruction of that magnificent workers' movement in Chile. You have to read Mike Gonzalez's article for it to be clear. Where are Poland's colonies to explain the defection of leadership, of solidarity to opportunism, reformism, and Catholicism? Can't explain it at all in those sorts of terms. I think we have to say, the same, again, Dave Beecham and Anne Idenham's excellent article on Brazil in the Journal about a year ago. New party, PT is born, and so on. Problem of reformism comes to the fore. Again, unless you want to say it's the Amazon jungle or something, where are Brazil's colonies to explain it? We have to say, I think, that there is no necessary connection even between imperialism and reformism. It looked as if there was, of course, in 1914, because when you ask where was advanced industrial capitalism in 1914, it was in those countries which were also imperialist countries in the sense of colony-conquering countries. But it's not true today. Capitalism has spread much more widely and much more deeply in the world. Industrial capitalism has developed in all sorts of places, and it's quite clear all over the world that the question of reformism now, we have to say, is not attached to any question of imperialist super-exploitation of colonies and so on. It is attached to the phenomena of advanced capitalism generally. Somehow, its roots are in advanced capitalism. Now, the truth is that, when we look back, in reality, Cliff is very clear on this, and we're very, very correct. Lenin's experience of the Western European labour movements was extremely limited. Very limited indeed. All his attention, even when he was in exile, was focused on Russia. All his writings are about Russia. He has very, very little to say in his writings, and he was never practically involved in any of the West European labour movements. He was always involved in Russia, even when he was living outside it. And of course, in Russia, there was no strong basis for reformism in the Tsarist regime. There were reformist currents, of course, within the Russian movement, but it was very easy to beat them. The Bolsheviks, after all, remember what their name is, it's the majority. The Bolshevik means the majority. The Mensheviks, the reformist wing, actually took the name of minority. If you want a sign of a weak and stupid reformist tendency, it's one that calls itself the minority. I think I'm very happy that we call ourselves the Bolsheviks, but of course it's a lie. We're not the majority in the British labour movement at this point. We would like to be so. And the effects of Lenin's really rather poor understanding of the Western labour movements and Western working class movements and so on, and of the Bolsheviks' general weakness, in the circumstances after the victory of the Russian Revolution, when the Communist International was formed, and when there were rather weak and theoretically unformed and rather weakly rooted communist parties growing up in Europe after the war, who were very dependent on the Russians, too dependent on the Russians, lacking sufficient independent critical experience and so on and so on. Rosa Luxemburg, the potential alternative in a sense, had been murdered in 1919. They were all too Moscow dependent, and Moscow actually imposes on their inexperience, in a sense, terrible mistakes. The formation of the Red International of Labour Unions, for example, which was not really the proper way to approach the question of communist organisation in the labour movements and so on, as Donny and Cliff have shown in their book on Marxism and the trade unions very, very clearly, I think. It really has involved a long struggle for us, for the revolutionary Marxists in the world, to come to a proper understanding of reformism, it seems to me, in the world. And I think really, we have to say, I don't know what forgotten the name of the comrade who's going to speak on Trotsky and reformism shortly, today, later on. Sheila is going to say today about Trotsky and reformism. But I think my own view is that most of what we know about reformism we have learned within the Trotskyism movement. You know, we have learned more from Trotsky than from Lenin, because Lenin died in 1924. Trotsky was not murdered till 1940, and it is within Trotskyism, within the left opposition, that really, and the struggle to work out what the strategy and tactics of combating reformism in advanced labour movements, most of that experience, as I say, has, I think, been developed within that tradition. The post-Leninism, if you like. Now, we also have to note that theories like Lenin's still have effects in the world today. There are still people who hold to versions of Lenin's theories. For example, theories that sectionalism in the class is the key to understanding the problems of the class. For example, that men's privileges. If you want a version of Lenin's labour aristocracy theory, today you find it in versions of feminism, for example, that say the central problem of women's condition in capitalism is men's privileges. That the central problem of racism is the privileges of white workers. The third worldists, many of them, who say that the Western working class as a whole has been bought off by imperialist profit. And you get it really, and a fairly old book now, by Frantz Fanon, for example, a book called The Wretched of the Earth, which was a key third worldist text of the 1950s and 1960s, who declared not only is the working class of the West or the advanced countries completely bought off, counter-revolutionary and so on, so even is the working class of the third world. The only revolutionary, truly revolutionary class in the world is the lumpen proletariat of a third world city, the unorganized, most degraded and depressed and oppressed masses of the back streets of Algiers, or the back streets of Mexico City, Buenos Aires, etc., etc., etc. That is where revolutionary initiative can be looked for. That is where revolutionary hope for the world comes from. You see, the problem with that theory is this. And I mean, I'm not saying that Lenin says this, but this is what Leninists have said. Essentially, they've said, what is the problem for the unorganized? It's the organized. The organized are to blame. The organized sections of the class are to blame for the condition of the unorganized. Not that the organized, actually the problem is that there may not be mechanisms by which the organized are helping the unorganized to organize, but actually they are the barrier to the improvement of the condition of the unorganized. In other words, the emphasis is on stressing division and disunity within the movement rather than looking for the points of unity and solidarity between different sections of the class. It is a theory which fundamentally writes off the working class whenever it begins to organize itself. Because those who organize themselves are betraying the unorganized. And I never heard of a more lunatic attitude and a more un-Marxist and unhopeful attitude than that. And it doesn't correspond to experience. Just one example of how it doesn't correspond to experience. You look at Solidarity in Poland. Who led Solidarity? Who got it going? The skilled, more advanced workers, the best paid workers in the biggest factories, and so on. The point was that the way in which they fought provided a fantastic inspiration. Because they fought on general class demand, they provided a fantastic inspiration to the more difficult to organize workers, the more backward workers, the more isolated and fragmented workers in the smaller plants, in the offices and so on. Because they were really fighting, they pulled all the others behind them into a gigantic movement. And that, it seems to me, is the mechanism by which reform struggles are converted into revolutionary struggles. Not by some mechanical notion of condemning the advanced and organized workers for their advanced and organized character. Now, there isn't time, I'm sorry to say, and anyway, I'm not sure that I could do it today, to develop a better theory of reformism here, but I do intend to try to do so in the future. I promised to write an article for the IS Journal, which I hope you'll all criticise if it ever gets to be published, because it will have to be the start of a discussion. But I think we have to start, I'm only going to say one thing. We have to reject the idea that there are two layers, separate layers within the working class, which are in some kind of antagonism with each other. That is not a starting point for understanding reformism. To think that there is one reformist layer and presumably underneath it one revolutionary layer that hasn't got its act together yet. What rather we have to say is that there are two contradictory tendencies within the class movement as a whole, one of which is a tendency to be involved in struggle, promoted by capitalism. The other is a tendency to be contained within capitalism, to be conservative, and so on. And the two tendencies are at war in the breast of every one of us, to be a fighter and to be conservative. And they are differently strong in different periods for different historical reasons, but the tendency is within the whole of the working class to be divided and atomized and also to be united, to be fighting and to be conservative. And that, it seems, somehow, in that sort of a way, it seems to me, we have to understand the history of reformism for the last 100 years in the world working class movement. We have to start with something like that, rather than with some mechanical picture of there being two layers, one of which is bought off and reformist, and the other of which is somehow the hopeful mankind.